Hello everyone, my name is Rocío Caporale and I'm a teacher from the city of La Plata. In this video, I will be analyzing the novel To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This is the first time I record myself doing something like this, so I hope it turns out well. I will be looking at my notes here and on the computer, but I will try to do my best. I will start speaking about modernism. Modernism implies a break with the past. During the first half of the 20th century, there were some social advances that made it necessary for writers to find new ways to express themselves, because the way of telling things that they had inherited from Victorian narratives was not enough. So they struggled to find new techniques to express the way they now saw the world. As Bradbury and Macfarlane say in their text, The Name and the Nature of Modernism, the nature of modernism is quite difficult to delimit because it happened in many places at different times. It's an international movement, and it didn't happen only in literature. We can find modernism in architecture, in music, and in art, among other things. So it's kind of a broad movement, but in this video I will be speaking of modernism in literature in England, because we are reading Virginia Woolf. So what modernist writers tried to do was to experiment different techniques to accomplish this goal or this need they had to tell the readers, to tell their audience, the way in which they saw the world. I will quote Harvey now in Modernity and Modernism. He says that modernism became preoccupied with finding a language that could represent eternal truths. And to do so, modernists had to violate the tactics of expected continuities. What does he mean? It means what I have just said, that these writers were looking for different ways to express this new reality they were facing. Some of these techniques, which we will find here, have to do with breaking with expected continuities, rejecting the traditional narrative frame of chronological order, of the beginning, the middle part, and the end, and also to work with different techniques such as the stream of consciousness. So after having said this, I will try to see how these techniques, which are not something just aesthetic, it's much more than that. It's the way in which modernist writers try to help us understand the world in how they saw it. I will try to look for these techniques in the book. So, speaking of chronological order of what was expected, well, the book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 and Part 3 are only about 1 day. However, they are the longest parts in the book, while Part 2, which encompasses 10 years, it's just some pages. So here we've got something that is different from what is expected in tradition, because we don't expect 1 day to be narrated in 100 pages for saying something new. To give an example, and 10 years to be narrated in 5-6 pages. So here we see how Virginia Woolf is trying to reject the tradition. And also in terms of events, if Part 1 doesn't have many events or many actions, it's James' wish to go to the lighthouse, Mrs. Ramsey going to the town, Lily Briscoe trying to paint, and finally the dinner. And in part 3 there are fewer actions. It's Lily Briscoe finishing her painting and Mr. Ramsey and his children going to the lighthouse. While in part number 2 there are many events that in a traditional narrative one would expect to be narrated in more detail, or at least to take more pages. In part 2 we learn that Mrs. Ramsey is dead. For instance, when I read that part, I had to go back and reread it, because I thought I had understood wrong, because I expected the death of Mrs. Ramsey to have a more significant place in the book. However, it's Virginia Woolf mentions in one sentence or two at least that Mrs. Ramsey is dead, and also Prue and also Andrew, and apart from these characters' deaths, we also learned that the First World War is going on. So these are kind of important events that are just mentioned, and this second part of the book works as a bridge between the first and the last one. And so here we see, with a specific example, how this going against typical ways of chronological order or traditional narrative work. So, speaking also about the structure of the text, Marina Ludwig's in Epiphany and Closure in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse will speak of Eshelman's theory of performatism. Eshelman's theory is for postmodernist text, but Ludwig's manages to apply it to the Lighthouse. So, what Eshelman says is that for a work to be performatist, it has to have, among other things, a forced closure by the device of the double frame. What is the double frame? Well, there are two plots. In the case of To the Lighthouse, we've got Mr. Ramsey and James wanted, James wanting to go to the lighthouse, and in the end going there with Mr. Ramsey, and then we've got the other plot of Lily Briscoe's struggle to finish her painting. So, in this case, the outer frame will be the one from Lily Briscoe. We are witnesses to Lily Briscoe's struggle. We get to know what people tell her about her painting. We also witness her moment of epiphany, and where she finally manages to finish her painting and come to terms with it. And at the same time that she finishes her painting, the other plot, the inner one, the one of going to the lighthouse, also closes, because it's at the moment that she sees that Mr. Ramsey and her children are arriving to the shore of the lighthouse. At that very moment, she finishes her painting and the story ends. And here Ludwig says something that I find very interesting and that I quite agree with her. She says that we are left with this feeling of dissatisfaction because with the plot of Lily Briscoe, we do feel satisfied because we could see everything that went into her mind, what other people told her, her two attempts to finish her painting, the first epiphany she had in the first part of the book at the dinner, and then the second epiphany where she can finally finish her novel. But with the plot of Mr. Ramsay and his son, we feel that we need more because it's not truly developed. There are many things that could be written about this father and son complicated relationship and what happened with their relationship after Mrs. Ramsay's death. But this feeling is there on purpose because Virginia Woolf is toying with this idea of the traditional narrative plot. So I did enjoy that theoretical text because it helped me understand that feeling of needing more that I was having. So here what I tried to do is was to explain the different logics modernism had to narrate its novels in this case, and to see these different techniques working. Now I'm going to speak of Lily's epiphany, because I think it's something that it's also important, these sudden realizations in modernism. Because here what again Ludwig says is that Lily's epiphany is an aesthetic moment because she is aware of the sign, in this case Mr. Ramsay and his children arriving to the lighthouse, and the imaginary referent, which I believe is Mrs. Ramsay. What do I mean by this? I kind of drew a parallel between Mrs. Ramsay and the lighthouse. Both of them are sources of inspiration. The lighthouse for James and Mrs. Ramsay for Lily's abstract painting. And also both of them are guides, literally and metaphorically. In the case of the lighthouse, it's a guide for ships, and in the case of Mrs. Ramsay, she is a guide for her family. So I think that at the very, and this is just my personal opinion, that at the very moment when Mr. Ramsay and James arrived to the lighthouse, Lily kind of understands the function, the social role of Mrs. Ramsay, that was to guide her family, to feel everyone, to make everyone feel together. And I think it's at that very time that she has the inspiration that she was lacking to finish her abstract painting. This is just something that I believe, of course. Sorry. So speaking of this, I already spoke about the closure of the two plots, the Mr. Ramsay lighthouse plot and Lily Briscoe's painting, and also about the epiphany. But I feel that there's another plot, and that's it's a real plot, let's say, because we've got Mr. Ramsay, arriving to the lighthouse with James and Cam. Lily Briscoe finishing her painting, but at the same time Virginia Woolf, the real author, finishing her novel. And here I want to draw a parallel between Virginia Woolf and Lily Briscoe. Why? Well, I first thought of this because I saw that at the same time that Lily, the artist, finished her painting, Virginia, the artist, finished her novel. And so here we've got two women, one fictional and the other real, of course, that had struggled to make people understand their art, because Lily Briscoe is painting abstract art and Virginia Woolf is writing a modernist novel which was not accepted by everyone at that time. Many people thought that that wasn't proper art. We see this struggle between what is art and what is not in the novel. When Lily Briscoe and Mr. Banks talk about the painting, we see that Mr. Banks cannot understand why Lily decides to paint Mrs. Ramsay and her child as a purple triangle, especially because Mrs. Ramsay was a sign of beauty. She was very beautiful, and why had Lily chosen to draw her as a purple triangle instead of representing her actual beauty? So in the same way that Lily was questioned by society in general, and in that specific case by Mr. Banks, Virginia Woolf and the kind of art she wrote was also questioned. And besides this, we've got the struggle of the woman trying to find her voice, and this is also in fiction for Lily Briscoe, but also in real life for Woolf. In the novel, we can also see that whenever Lily is painting, she feels that she cannot succeed. She thinks of what Mr. Tansley told her, that women can't paint, women can't write. And here we see that Mr. Tansley says women can't paint, but also women can't write. Of course that women could paint and write as hobbies, but not as, they couldn't be, or they weren't supposed to be professional painters or professional writers. They were supposed to get married and have children and take care of them, just that. So I think that Virginia Woolf uses the character of Lily also to express her reality, and it's on purpose that Mr. Tansley says women can't paint, but also women can't write, even though Lily doesn't write. And one last thing I would like to say about this, about this phrase that keeps sounding on Lily's mind, is that we never actually see the dialogue between Mr. Tansley and Lily Briscoe having this conversation where he says women can't paint, women can't write. We get to know about this conversation because the author shows us Lily's mind. And this is what I spoke earlier at the beginning of the presentation, the stream of consciousness. So, sorry, give me a minute. I'm trying to find this part of my notes. So I was saying that this women can't paint, women can't write had to do with the stream of consciousness. What is a stream of consciousness? Is the way modernist writers express what goes on in our mind. Whenever we are having think of our daily lives, when we are doing anything, maybe I'm recording this video and I'm thinking of something else, or maybe I'm driving and I'm recalling a conversation I had with someone. So all these things that happen in our mind, in the plane of the in the unconscious, is what modernist writers try to represent in their writings. And this is something very interesting, because it's something that even though it's sometimes kind of difficult to read these kind of texts, or at least for me it was difficult, because sometimes I wasn't sure of if that thing that I was reading was actually a dialogue, or if it was in someone's mind, and if it was in someone's mind, in whose mind it was. Even though it's kind of difficult, once you get used to it, it's very nice, or at least it was like that for me, because I could see myself in those characters, because I'm all day thinking, and I think that's very real. Modernists, I said at the beginning of this presentation that modernists were trying to express the way they saw life, the way they saw the world, the way they saw the subject, that was body but also mind. And so this technique they use, and I think it's Malcolm Bradbury and James McFarlane that talk about the stream of consciousness as a technique. It was very effective. To close this presentation, I would like to read a quote by Virginia Woolf that says the following, and is related to the stream of consciousness and all that I was speaking about. It goes like this: life is not a series of jig lamps symmetrically arranged. Life is a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope, surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end. Let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. Let us trace the pattern, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance, which each slighter incident scores upon the consciousness. What Virginia Woolf is doing here is to defend this new way of designing the novel. She is seeking to represent both the conscious but also the unconscious. And this is what modernist writers were trying to do, and how they were trying to cope with the new advances on psychology and the new era they were facing. Well, I know that I have made some mistakes while speaking. I got nervous at some point, but I hope that this presentation is clear. I recorded it so many times that I lost the count of them. But, well, I hope that you like it. And if you have any doubts, please do tell me, because it was a reading that I really enjoyed. Bye.